Hi, everybody. Today we are going to paint some tattooed faces, and the concept is pretty simple. We'll be working with flat human portraits like the ones we did a few weeks ago, and applying the same kind of porcelain style patterns that we used on the animal series. Essentially, we are going to tattoo the faces using the same ornamental designs. Simple like that. So let's start with sketching. Drawing the human face isn't the hardest part. You just need a few reference points and some guidelines. And once you got that in place, it becomes fairly straightforward. And don't forget, we already have quite a few videos specifically focused on sketching portraits, as well as how to transfer those sketches onto the canvas you'll be painting on. So feel free to check them out. Okay, so now it's time to paint. I have already refined my sketches, so I'm starting the painting process the same way we did with the animals. A dark background first, then a flat base layer for the face. My initial plan was to keep everything completely flat. No shading, no highlights. But as often happens, I found myself drifting back to my usual style. Once your artistic voice begins to emerge, it's hard to silence it. So it's like handwriting. You can try to adapt someone else's, but eventually your own slips back in. So even though I originally planned to keep it all flat, I ended up adding some shadows and highlights. And it wasn't until I was already working on the third piece that I realized that I had totally flipped the script. I am so sorry about that. But that wasn't part of the plan, it just came naturally. And honestly, I think the results are quite good. But please, don't feel intimidated if the final look seems a bit more complex than expected, because it really isn't. The portraits are just as simple as the flat ones. I only added 2 extra layers, one for shadows and one for the highlights. You can absolutely skip those if you're not comfortable with them. And the results will be absolutely the same, if not better. The first painting in a series is usually just a tryout, kind of a lab test. And it will look awful most of times because we are still figuring out if the concept works, how the components interact, and if adjustments are needed. That's why I always recommend doing a series. If you create one piece and it doesn't turn out how you envisioned, it's easy to get discouraged. But often, it's just that you're still learning how to bring the idea to life. By the time you got to the second or third piece, everything will flow more easily and the results will look much better. Another thing that changed from the concept to the execution was the skin tones. At first, I wanted the faces to be as white as porcelain. Once again, like the animals we painted before. But I quit that idea because they would end up looking too bluish, freckly like dead people. So, no. So I switched to a more natural skin tone, still pale, but with more warmth. I kept the blue for shadows and white for highlights, but I moved away from using those colors as primarily skin tones. The process remained the same. I paint the basic face, then layer on the decorative designs. Now, let's talk about the design choice. I opted for a Chinese porcelain pattern, not only for its visual appeal, but because I wanted to steer clear of referencing specific ethnic traditions. Many cultures have deep rooted practice involving facial tattoos, and I didn't want to mimic or misrepresent any of them. So the porcelain style, while still tattoo like, adds a symbolic weight without touching on specific cultural aspects. The concept here is twofold. The body is fragile and beauty is superficial. Initially, I was leaning more towards the frailty of the body aspect, but since the portraits ended up looking more natural than porcelain pieces, the idea of superficial beauty started to feel more present. Still, I believe both themes are still valid for this particular project. Projects like this are always full of surprises, especially since many of the elements here are things I'm trying for the first time. Just so you know, all the exercises and paintings we've been doing this time around haven't been strictly planned. I usually have a theme in mind, of course, but beyond that, there is no prior testing or trial runs to see if things work. So, in many ways, it's all quite experimental. Of course, I repeat techniques and visual styles because they are part of my own visual language, but I try not to repeat ideas. For instance, if I return to tattooed faces in the future, I certainly will explore them through a different lens. One specific challenge I encountered was figuring out how the designs would behave on dark skin. I originally wanted the skin tone for this piece to be very dark, but in the end, I chose a rather lighter shade, burnt amber to be precise, with some highlights. I used blue for the shadows and white for the highlights, and it turned out well, I think. Quick tip: remember that acrylics dry fast and darker. So if you want smoother blending, use a pouring medium. It makes the paint more translucent, not thinner, and works beautifully with layering highlights. The same as what it does to watercolor or thinners to oils. Acrylics dry fast, usually 5 to 10 minutes, but I let the pieces sit overnight just for convenience. Once everything was dry, I added more shadows and highlights. Once again, not the original plan, but that's how the work evolved. I considered giving this woman a blonde hair to contrast with the dark skin and the dark background. But in the end, I went with natural hair color because it just worked better. I did, however, add blue eyes as a subtle twist, and I think it adds a nice, unexpected touch. The dark paint will cover the sketch lines, so when it comes to painting the tattoos, the sketches might be lost. But don't worry, these designs are quite simple once you get the hang of them. So you don't need to sketch them out again. But if you're unsure, it's totally fine to lightly mark them with a soft pencil. I am actually considering dedicating a midweek video just to practice these ornaments and patterns with you. These were all painted rather quickly. Each one took about 30 to 45 minutes because this is a practice exercise. But if you want more polished, gallery ready results, just spend more time. For a commissioned piece, I would spend at least a full day on each portrait. And that's all we have for today. I hope you like how the pieces turned out. And I hope you find this inspiring and that you've learned something new today. As always, keep on practicing and thank you for joining us.